The air in the chamber is thick with incense, the coppery tang of blood mingling with the acrid smoke of melted promethium. My hands tremble as they rest upon the cold engraved stone of the sacrificial altar, every line of the emperor's visage carved into the slab seeming to watch, to judge. They say those who are offered here are chosen, blessed to become vessels of divine purpose. Yet standing here I feel neither blessed nor chosen. I feel a terror deeper than the void between stars, a gnawing that no litany can soothe. The chanting of the adeptus ministorum echoes off the vaulted ceiling, a cacophony of devotion that drowns out my thoughts, yet somehow sharpens the perception of my own insignificance. This is the world of the imperium, where devotion demands the ultimate surrender and obedience is measured in heartbeats and breaths. Today, the thin veil between mortal life and the emperor's judgment feels unbearably close. If you want to witness what truly unfolds behind the sanctified curtains of the emperor's service, beyond the pomp, beyond the prayers, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Join me as we descend into the ritual, the horror, and the devotion that define the lives of those offered to the God Emperor himself. The corridor leading to the sacrificial chamber was narrow and suffocating, the walls slick with condensation that smelled faintly of incense and iron. I walked with the others, every step measured, every breath pulled taut against the weight of expectation. The air vibrated with whispers, not loud enough to be spoken, but carried in the shuffle of feet and the occasional hitch of a terrified gasp. Names were already forgotten. Faces blurred together beneath the flickering torchlight, their eyes wide, reflecting both devotion and dread. I realized with a cold clarity that none of us were chosen by chance. The adeptus ministorum had decided, and in their judgment, we were already beyond appeal. At the threshold of the chamber, the sound of chanting grew insistent, a hypnotic cadence that pressed against my ribs like the hand of an invisible master. The voices were melodic, almost gentle, yet there was a power in them that brooked no defiance. I thought I could feel the words reaching through my skin, insinuating themselves into my heartbeat, synchronizing it to the ritual's rhythm. Around me, others trembled. Some clutched at rosaries or charms, their knuckles white, their lips moving in prayers I could not hear. Others stood rigid, faces pale, arms at their sides, masks of obedience hiding the terror coiled inside. The chamber itself was an antechamber of shadow and stone, the kind of place where light and darkness fought for dominance in the corners, leaving the walls to drink in every flicker and movement. In the center, the altar rose like a monolith, carved from black stone veined with streaks of crimson that glinted in the torchlight. The emperor's visage was etched into it, serene yet omnipotent, his eyes carved with a depth that seemed almost alive, watching, judging, weighing. The priests moved around it with deliberate grace, their robes whispering over the stone floor, each step a note in a silent hymn that none of us were permitted to break. A priest approached, his face hidden beneath a hood, and I felt the air tighten around me as his gaze passed over my trembling form. He carried a data slate, its surface glowing faintly, inscriptions shifting in a language older than any of us. Each of us was examined, our identities reduced to marks and sigils, as though our flesh and blood were nothing but data points in the emperor's grand design. The markings were precise, almost surgical, applied with instruments that seemed borrowed from a Skitari forge rather than a convent. Pain was incidental, but unavoidable, a subtle reminder that devotion was never comfortable. I glanced around at the others. One young man, barely more than a boy, pressed his palms together so tightly that his knuckles cracked. A woman, her hair cropped close, stared straight ahead, refusing to blink. In that moment, I understood. The true sacrifice was not the flesh alone, but the surrender of self, the acceptance of being catalogued, measured, and offered. Our lives were ours no longer. We were instruments to a melody played on a scale far beyond comprehension. Fear mingled with a strange reverence, a recognition that even in terror there was purpose. The chanting swelled, rising to a pitch that pressed against the skull. It was then I felt the first subtle vibration through the stone beneath my feet. the altar resonating with a power that seemed not entirely physical. The priest's movements became more deliberate, more exacting, each gesture layered with significance. I caught a glimpse of the sacrificial implements, blades honed to impossible sharpness, vials of oils and balms that steamed faintly, their fumes bitter and metallic. Each object seemed ordinary in isolation, but in the chamber, in this moment, they were instruments of inevitability. I thought of life outside, of the world beyond the walls of the Ministorum. The sun felt distant, almost mythic, and yet its memory clung to me. I imagined its warmth, a comfort I would not touch again. The air here was thicker than any void, heavy with anticipation, dread, and devotion. And yet, despite the fear, I could not deny a flicker of awe. There was something sublime in the precision, the sanctity of it all, a terrifying beauty that held the heart in thrall. When my name, or what they called my name, was whispered from the lips of the priest, it was not a sound, but a vibration that reached straight into the marrow. I stepped forward, knowing that hesitation was not an option, that every heartbeat carried me closer to what I had been chosen for. Behind me, the others followed, each stepping toward the altar like moths drawn to flame, and I understood, finally, that the sacrifice was not only of life, but of certainty, of comfort, of the fragile illusion that one's existence belonged solely to oneself. As I laid my hands upon the cold stone, tracing the carved lines of the Emperor's face, a shiver ran through me. This was the threshold, the edge between life as I had known it and something incomprehensible, a world where devotion demanded absolute surrender. Somewhere deep in the chanting, I thought I heard the faintest echo of my own fear, swallowed instantly by the chorus of voices, leaving only the rhythm of inevitability. And in that moment I understood the truth of being chosen. There was no escape. Only the ceremony, only the flesh, and only the Emperor's gaze. The altar's stone was colder than I had imagined, biting through the thin fabric of my robes and into the marrow of my bones. I pressed my palms harder against it, trying to anchor myself in the solidity beneath me, but the vibrations from the ritual seemed to rise from the very core of Terra itself, shaking the air and my resolve in equal measure. The priests moved in a silent choreography, their motions fluid yet precise, as if each step, each gesture had been rehearsed since before any of us were born. Their hoods shadowed their faces, leaving only glimpses of eyes that burned with unwavering devotion, and I felt simultaneously comforted and terrified by their certainty. A soft hum began to rise from the altar, almost imperceptible at first, but growing steadily, threading through the chants and the metallic tang of blood. It was not sound alone. It pressed on my chest, vibrating through my ribs and teeth, demanding attention, demanding surrender. My heart hammered in rhythm with it, each beat a drum marking the passage closer to the unknown. Around me, the others stiffened, their bodies reacting in the same instinctive dance of dread and awe. Some whispered prayers under their breaths. Others closed their eyes entirely, trying to vanish into the sanctuary of their own mind. Though I knew none could escape the ceremony, one priest extended a hand toward me, offering a chalice filled with a thick, dark liquid that steamed faintly. The fumes carried a scent of iron and incense, bitter and clinging, and I knew instinctively that it was meant to purge fear, to cleanse hesitation, to bind the willing to the act. I raised it to my lips, tasting the acrid burn as it slid down my throat. A fire ignited within me, searing and purifying, leaving nothing but clarity. Fear remained, yes, but sharpened into awareness. I was aware of every detail. The grooves in the stone beneath my hands, the flicker of torchlight against the carved emperor, the quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air as a hidden mechanism within the altar clicked into motion. The chamber seemed to expand and contract simultaneously. Shadows deepened in the corners while light pooled over the altar as though drawn there by some unseen gravity. I could hear my own breathing, but it was different now, amplified, precise, measured, as though the ritual had claimed not just my body but the very rhythm of my life. The boy to my left shivered violently, and the woman across the altar flinched at the whisper of her own name. Every motion of the priests was mirrored in the subtle, almost spiritual tremors that rippled through us all. It was a world where obedience was life, and hesitation was already death. I felt my resolve solidifying, a hard kernel of purpose forming in the pit of my stomach. The fear had not vanished. It could never vanish. But it had transformed into something else, something like reverent acceptance. Each heartbeat, each shiver of flesh, each inhalation of the incense-heavy air carried me forward, closer to the point of no return. I was no longer merely a participant. I was an instrument, a conduit through which devotion would flow, a vessel for forces far beyond my comprehension. The altar's surface shifted beneath my hands, subtle at first, then unmistakably, as though the stone itself recognized the moment had arrived. A faint. The priest's hand lowered slightly, and I felt the tension in the chamber deepen, coiling like a living thing around each of us. The altar seemed to thrum beneath my palms, its cold stone now vibrating with a subtle insistence, as if the Emperor's presence were settling into the room itself. The glow along the carved visage intensified, spilling across the faces of the others in a muted radiance, and in that light, every feature, every tremor, every whisper of fear became starkly visible. I could see the boy's wide eyes glistening with unshed tears, the tight set of the woman's jaw as she swallowed against the weight of her own panic, and the rigid lines of those who had already embraced their role in the ritual. A low chant rose from the priests, a deep, sonorous vibration that seemed to anchor the ceremony in both time and eternity. Each syllable carried weight, a declaration of devotion and inevitability that resonated through our bones. The air itself felt thicker, pressing down with the invisible force of judgment. I inhaled slowly, tasting the copper of my own blood, the bitter tang of incense, and the acrid sting of fear, each element fusing into a single potent awareness. My senses sharpened. Every flicker of torchlight, every distant echo of footfalls in the chamber, every subtle shift in the priest's robes registered with crystalline clarity. It was then that the subtle ritual of marking began. A slender instrument, like a stylus forged from the finest alloys of the adeptus mechanicus, traced patterns across my forearm, leaving impressions that burned briefly with a sensation both painful and alien. Each line was precise, deliberate, a language older than the imperium itself, and I understood that it was not merely flesh being inscribed, but allegiance, destiny, and submission. The markings glowed faintly under the torchlight, tiny veins of luminescence mapping devotion directly onto skin. Others received the same treatment. I felt the collective inhalation of the chamber as the patterns took shape, binding us to the ceremony, to the altar, and ultimately, to the Emperor. The room seemed to contract, walls leaning inward, heightening the claustrophobic intimacy of the moment. The boy stifled a gasp as the final line was etched into his shoulder, and I caught a flicker of panic in the priest's eyes, a reminder that even those devoted to the Emperor were vessels of imperfection, momentarily human, briefly vulnerable. Yet the ritual pressed on, relentless, unyielding, and I felt an odd kinship in that shared vulnerability. We were not merely individuals. We were a congregation of the chosen, each pulse and breath contributing to a rhythm older than any single life. A bell tolled somewhere deep within the chamber, resonant and metallic, vibrating through the stone and into our bones. It signaled a shift, an invisible threshold that none of us could name but all instinctively recognized. The priests moved with renewed urgency, their hands raised in synchronized motion, weaving the air with gestures that seemed to shape the very essence of devotion. The altar responded, the carved lines of the Emperor's face shimmering as if acknowledging our presence, our submission, our small but essential role in this grand, terrifying liturgy. I closed my eyes briefly, and in the darkness behind my lids, I saw visions not entirely of my own making, the faintest glimmers of the Emperor's might, rumors whispered by the fearful and the faithful alike, fragments of his consciousness stretching across Terra, watching, judging, guiding. They were rumors, perhaps, yet they carried the weight of truth in the quiet terror they inspired. And I understood that here, at the nexus of fear, devotion, and inevitability, the mortal body was nothing. The essence of faith, surrender, and recognition was everything. When I opened my eyes, the chamber had grown quieter, the chanting softening into a hum that seemed to echo from the altar itself. The priest's blade now hovered directly above the markings, catching the flicker of torchlight in a line of brilliance that made the carved eyes of the emperor appear to glow with intensity. My hands tightened against the altar, knuckles white, yet my mind was astonishingly calm, focused, aware. Fear had transformed into clarity. The moment demanded nothing less than total presence, and I gave it freely, unflinching, wholly. The first ripple of anticipation passed through the room as the priest's hand moved in a deliberate, almost tender motion. Each of us felt the shift in air, the subtle tightening of reality around the altar, the almost imperceptible alignment of spirit and flesh. I realized, with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade, that this was the essence of being chosen, to exist in the threshold, to understand that mortality was secondary to the echo of devotion that would outlast flesh and blood. In this suspended space, I was both terrified and exalted, insignificant and central, alive and already part of something greater than comprehension. The moment was poised, fragile as glass yet unbreakable, a point where every heartbeat mattered, where the line between life and legend blurred. And as I braced for what came next, I understood that the true sacrifice had already begun, not with blood, but with the surrender of certainty, the acceptance of inevitability, and the silent acknowledgement that we were no longer wholly our own. The final preparations unfolded with a precision that left no room for hesitation. The priests moved as though part of a single organism, their robes whispering across the stone floor in harmony with the low, resonant hum of the altar. Each motion was deliberate, each gesture steeped in centuries of ritual. The subtle metallic scent of promethium mingled with the coppery tang of blood, creating an atmosphere both sacred and unbearable. I could feel it cling to my lungs, heavy with the weight of inevitability yet necessary, like the air itself had become part of the emperor's judgment. The boy near me trembled violently, his lips moving in prayers too quiet to be heard over the collective resonance of the chamber. The woman opposite him held her gaze on the altar, but I could see the tight tension in her jaw, the small, controlled tremors in her hands. We were all poised on the precipice, aware that the moment demanded absolute focus. The altar seemed to pulse beneath our palms, a slow heartbeat that matched the rhythm of our own fear, binding us to the ceremony with an almost physical insistence. The priest raised the slender silver blade, its edge catching the flickering light, sending reflections across the carved features of the emperor. I felt my chest tighten, an instinctive awareness of what was to come. Yet amid the fear, a strange clarity emerged. Fear had transformed into reverent presence, a recognition that every heartbeat, every breath, was a note in a symphony older than Terra itself. The altar was not merely stone. It was a vessel of purpose, a conduit through which devotion and mortality would intersect, and I could feel the weight of that convergence pressing down on me. A subtle vibration ran through the chamber, harmonizing with the chants and the whispered prayers. It was more than sound. It was a presence, tangible and inescapable. The glow from the emperor's visage intensified, illuminating the faint carvings etched into our arms and shoulders, revealing the intricate patterns of allegiance and destiny. The markings pulsed faintly, resonating with the rhythm of the altar, and I understood that they were not merely symbolic, they were a bridge, linking our mortal flesh to the sacred ritual. I took a slow, deliberate breath, tasting the acrid blend of incense and iron, and felt my resolve harden. This was the essence of being chosen, the surrender of certainty, the acceptance of one's role within something far greater than self. Each of us stood poised, vessels of devotion, instruments through which the emperor's will would flow. The boy whimpered softly, but no one turned to him, no one faltered. We were bound together in shared submission, each pulse of our hearts echoing through the stone chamber like the beat of some colossal, unseen entity. The priest lowered the blade closer, the point hovering over the patterns etched into my arm. The anticipation was a living thing, coiling through my veins, tightening in my chest. And yet beneath the fear there was an undeniable awe. I felt the presence of something immense, vast beyond comprehension, a force that transcended flesh and bone. It was the Emperor, or a fragment of his will, reaching into the mortal world to claim what had been offered, guiding the ritual with invisible hands. Time itself seemed suspended. The air trembled with expectation, the walls of the chamber vibrating faintly with the resonance of faith and fear intertwined. My hands were steady on the altar, knuckles white. Yet my mind was impossibly clear, focused on every sensation, the chill of stone against skin, the metallic taste in the air, the vibration in my chest, the faint glow tracing the carvings on my flesh. It was a moment where mortal instinct collided with divine expectation, where life and legend intertwined in a single unbroken thread. And in that suspended instant, I understood the true nature of being chosen. It was not privilege, nor was it mercy. It was surrender. Total, unwavering surrender to something beyond comprehension. The mortal self receded, replaced by a vessel for devotion, a conduit for the sacred and ineffable. I was alive, and yet no longer solely mine. My body, my breath, my heartbeat belonged to the ritual, to the altar, and to the Emperor's gaze, unseen yet undeniable. The chamber fell into a hushed stillness, the vibrations of the ritual threading through us all, binding the chosen together in a shared awareness of mortality, duty, and transcendence. I could feel the other's presence as acutely as mine. The blade met the flesh with a whisper, a sound almost lost beneath the thrumming resonance of the chamber, yet it reverberated through every nerve ending as though the altar itself had spoken. Pain flared briefly, sharp and unyielding, but it was quickly subsumed by the rhythm of the ritual, the cadence of the chants that seemed to bind our very souls to the ceremony. I felt my body tense, then relax into the inevitability of the moment. Every instinct surrendered to the weight of devotion pressing down from the vaulted ceiling above. The glow from the Emperor's carved visage bathed the chamber in a light both holy and unforgiving, illuminating the taut faces of those around me, reflecting our fear and awe in equal measure. The priests moved with measured grace, their motions fluid and precise, each gesture a note in a symphony older than Terra itself. Silver implements gleamed in their hands, their edges honed to a perfection that seemed almost unnatural, tools not only of physical transformation, but of spiritual alignment. They traced invisible patterns through the air, coaxing the ritual forward, and each motion carried authority that none of us could question. I could feel the subtle pressure of unseen eyes. Fragments of the Emperor's consciousness rumored to linger, watching, guiding, ensuring that devotion was absolute. Every flicker of torchlight, every shiver of the stone beneath our feet, seemed to respond to the choreography, reinforcing the inexorable march toward the apex of the ceremony. The air was thick with incense and iron, pungent, almost suffocating, clinging to our lungs and coating every breath with the essence of ritual. It was intoxicating, binding, impossible to ignore, and it tethered my awareness to the altar with an almost physical force. The markings etched into my flesh pulsed faintly under the torchlight, tracing patterns that resonated with the vibrations of the blade and the hum of the chants. It was as if the ritual recognized our fear and devotion, converting it into something tangible, something that would endure long after the flesh itself was offered. Around me, the others moved through the ritual with a mixture of awe and terror. The boy, barely more than a boy, flinched at the smallest touch of the blade, yet he did not resist, his fear tempered by the gravity of obedience. The woman opposite me, stoic yet trembling beneath her controlled exterior, met the priest's gaze without flinching, offering her body as a vessel for devotion, her sacrifice complete in both form and spirit. And in that shared submission, I recognized the unity that the ritual demanded. Each of us, a singular thread woven into the vast tapestry of the Emperor's will. Our fear and awe transformed into devotion that transcended the flesh. The chanting swelled, rising to a pitch that pressed against the skull, a vibration that threaded through bone and marrow, harmonizing with the rhythm of the altar and the pulse of our own hearts. I could feel the subtle interplay of pain and awe, a sensation that sharpened every sense, heightened every perception. The taste of iron lingered on my tongue, the burn of incense stung my nostrils, and the flicker of torchlight traced shadows that danced across the carved features of the Emperor, animating them with a presence that felt almost alive. It was impossible to tell where the mortal world ended and the ritual began. Everything had become a single overwhelming experience of devotion and surrender. The priest's hands moved with meticulous precision, guiding the blade along the ritual's ordained path, drawing lines that cut through flesh without hesitation, leaving impressions that burned faintly with the weight of sacred purpose. Each mark was a declaration, an alignment, a testament to our surrender, and I could feel the subtle hum of energy that threaded through the chamber, linking all who were chosen in a network of devotion and inevitability. The boy stifled a whimper, the woman's breath hitched, but no one faltered. Fear was present, yes, but it was tempered, transformed into awareness, into recognition that this was not merely a ceremony of flesh, but of spirit, of alignment, of destiny. The altar thrummed beneath our palms, resonating with the cadence of the chants and the rhythm of the blade. I could feel the subtle vibrations threading through my body, aligning my awareness with the ritual, binding my consciousness to the flow of devotion that surrounded us. Time itself seemed suspended, each heartbeat stretched into eternity, each breath measured against the vastness of the Emperor's presence, real or imagined. And as the blade traced the final arc, leaving a line that shimmered faintly along the marking etched into my arm, I realized the essence of the moment. It was not the pain, nor the blood, nor even the fear that defined the sacrifice, but the absolute, unwavering surrender to a force far greater than ourselves. The blade's passage was meticulous, each movement deliberate, a dance of inevitability that left no space for hesitation. I felt the subtle heat of friction as it traced the engraved patterns on my skin, a sensation sharp yet strangely ritualistic, as though the pain itself was sanctified. Every nerve in my arm seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of the chants, harmonizing with the low hum of the altar, until the distinction between body and ritual blurred. Around me, the others flinched, whispered, or gasped, yet none resisted. Fear had been transformed into something more profound. Recognition of the altar's authority, submission to the weight of what had been chosen for us. The priest's movements were hypnotic, flowing like molten silver over the contours of the ritual space. Each gesture shaped the air, weaving invisible currents that bound flesh to purpose, mortal to divine. One priest paused to adjust a subtle alignment, his fingers brushing the edge of a carved symbol on my shoulder, and I felt a ripple through my spine, as though my body had become a tuned instrument resonating with the chamber itself. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the sensation of being wholly present and yet not entirely mine, of every heartbeat echoing far beyond the flesh that housed it. The air was heavy, a tangible presence pressed against our lungs, a blend of incense, iron, and the metallic sting of fear. I could taste it with each inhalation, bitter and electric, searing memory into my senses. The altar's glow intensified, illuminating the contours of the Emperor's visage with an almost sentient awareness, casting flickering reflections across the others' faces. I saw their terror, their awe, their surrender, and recognized the shared weight that bound us all in this sacred choreography. None were spared the gravity of the moment. All were tethered to its inexorable current. As the ritual continued, the blade traced intricate arcs, marking not merely flesh, but essence, leaving behind lines that seemed to hum faintly with unseen energy. I realized with a disorienting clarity that this was not merely a ceremony of pain, it was an act of transformation. The fear, the sweat, the taste of blood, the resonance of the altar, all were components of an alignment far older than any of us. Through the precision of the blade, through the cadence of the chants, through the subtle vibrations threading through the stone, the mortal body was converted into a vessel capable of echoing devotion, a living testament to the Emperor's will. The boy near me gasped sharply, but there was no chaos, no faltering. The woman across the altar inhaled with perfect control, her jaw tight, eyes fixed unwaveringly on the ceremonial glow. Every flinch, every shiver, every subtle reaction became part of the ritual's rhythm, a pulse threading together all of us chosen. weaving our mortal responses into something enduring, something beyond comprehension. I understood then that being chosen was not a privilege, nor was it an act of grace. It was the imposition of order, the bending of life to service, a merging of fear, reverence, and inevitability into a single, unbroken continuum. The priests moved closer, guiding the final phase of the marking, their motions almost imperceptibly synchronized. The blade's edge shimmered faintly in the torchlight, reflecting the altar's glow across the chamber, painting every face with light and shadow in turn. I felt the subtle vibration deepen, threading into my chest, into my limbs, into the core of my awareness, until my own heartbeat became inseparable from the rhythm of the ritual. The scent of iron grew stronger, a stark reminder of mortality, yet it was inseparable from the sacred, the divine purpose threading through each pulse and breath. And then, at the apex of the ceremony, a low, sonorous bell tolled, its resonance cutting through the chamber, through the chants and into the marrow of our bones. It was a punctuation, a declaration, a threshold crossing. I felt it as a wave, washing over me, carrying with it the weight of inevitability. I was no longer merely present. I was aligned, bound, a vessel of devotion poised at the intersection of life and legend. The blade lifted. The markings glimmered faintly under the torchlight. And I understood the true nature of our offering, that in surrendering flesh, in harmonizing fear with ritual, we had become more than mortal. Time seemed suspended. Every heartbeat stretched into eternity, every breath weighted with significance. The chamber pulsed with a rhythm older than terra, echoing in our bones, in our consciousness, threading our mortal selves into a continuum of service, sacrifice, and devotion. And in that suspended sacred moment, I felt the full gravity of what it meant to be chosen, not to be exalted, not to be spared, but to be transformed. A living testament to a power far beyond comprehension, whose judgment was absolute, and whose gaze, seen or imagined, would endure far longer than any. The final sequences of the ritual unfolded with a quiet inevitability that left no room for hesitation. The blade hovered briefly over the markings etched into our flesh, the torchlight glinting along its sharpened edge, and then descended with an almost imperceptible motion. Pain flared briefly, sharp yet fleeting, a reminder of the mortal shell that contained our consciousness. I felt the heat of it, the bite of metal against skin, yet it was swiftly subsumed by the pulse of the chamber, the resonance of chants, and the weight of shared submission. Every sense sharpened, every nerve ending alive, as though the altar itself were reading the rhythm of our fear and devotion, translating it into something tangible, something eternal. The priests moved with meticulous grace, their robes brushing the stone floor like flowing water. Each gesture was purposeful, each motion threaded with centuries of tradition, and every glance they cast beneath their hoods carried authority that none could question. The boy trembled beside me, lips moving in whispered prayers that merged with the larger cadence of the ritual, and I felt a surge of kinship with the others, strangers bound together in the crucible of devotion and inevitability. Our fear was individual, yet it coalesced into a shared awareness, a tapestry of trembling flesh and unwavering obedience, all feeding into the altar's silent, omnipotent gravity. The air was dense with incense, metallic tang, and the faint, persistent taste of iron. It clung to our lungs, wrapping every breath in the weight of the ceremony, making each inhalation a conscious act of submission. The carved visage of the emperor glowed faintly under the torchlight, the illumination shifting as if alive, acknowledging our presence, measuring our devotion, and judging our readiness. I could see every line of fear, every tightened jaw, every quickened breath, and it dawned on me that the altar did not merely witness the ritual, it amplified it, turning the sum of mortal fear, pain, and awe into a resonance that extended far beyond the chamber walls. The markings on our flesh pulsed faintly in time with the vibrations of the blade and the rhythm of the chants. They were more than symbols. They were conduits, bridging the fragile mortal body to the altar, to the ritual, to the fragment of divine presence rumored to linger within the stone. Each line traced by the priests carried significance beyond comprehension, an alignment of body and spirit, fear and devotion, life and legacy. I felt my own pulse sync with the patterns, my awareness narrowing to the sensation of resonance, the hum of energy threading through stone, flesh, and air, binding us all into a singular current of purpose. Time stretched. Each moment expanded, and I felt my consciousness merge with the rhythm of the ritual. Pain, fear, awe, they were no longer separate entities but components of a greater whole. The blade traced the final arc along my forearm, and I felt a subtle warmth, not of comfort, but of recognition, as if the ritual acknowledged my submission, my readiness, my alignment. Around me, the others shivered in unison, each heartbeat a thread in the vast network of devotion that pulsed invisibly through the chamber. The ceremony was no longer merely physical. It had become an experience that transcended flesh, a rhythm that connected our mortal selves to something far beyond comprehension. A low bell tolled somewhere deep within the chamber, reverberating through stone and bone alike. The vibration seemed to seep into the marrow of every participant, threading our fear, awe, and surrender into a single cohesive awareness. The priests moved to complete the final gestures of the marking, guiding the blade along paths that traced not just flesh but purpose, destiny, and devotion. I felt the subtle hum of the altar intensify, aligning with the cadence of our pulse, and understood with absolute clarity that we were no longer merely individuals. We were vessels of alignment, instruments of devotion, participants in a ritual older than memory itself. And the weight of this realization settled in my chest with a solemn permanence. As the blade finally lifted, leaving the etched patterns glowing faintly under the torchlight, a hush descended over the chamber. The vibrations of the ritual persisted, threading through us, through the stone and into some imperceptible void beyond comprehension. I felt a profound, almost terrifying connection to the others, to the altar, to the unseen presence of the Emperor whose gaze, real or imagined, seemed to pierce the marrow of my being. Fear remained, but it was sharpened into reverence, a recognition that the true nature of sacrifice was not merely the surrender of flesh, but the alignment of spirit with the eternal purpose that the ritual demanded. The chamber held its breath. The torchlight flickered across the carved visage of the Emperor, and I understood, with unshakable certainty, that the moment had achieved its apex. We were chosen, not by chance, not by mercy, but by the immutable weight of devotion and inevitability. Our fear, our pain, our presence, all had been transformed into something far greater than ourselves, a testament to the enduring power of obedience, ritual, and faith. And in that suspended, sacred silence, I felt the threshold between life and legacy, between mortal and legend, settle quietly around us all, binding our existence to the altar, to the Emperor, and to a devotion that would outlast flesh and blood. The chamber seemed to breathe, each inhalation a swell of incense, iron, and devotion that pressed against my chest and mingled with the rapid beat of my heart. The markings on my flesh glimmered faintly in the torchlight, following the pulse of the altar itself, as if the stone and the ritual had fused into a single living entity. I felt it resonate through me, through every nerve and sinew, a vibration that blurred the line between body and ceremony, fear and faith, mortality and legacy. Around me, the others mirrored this transformation, their breath controlled, their movements deliberate, their gaze fixed upon the sacred monolith before us. The priests moved with a quiet, devastating precision, their hands tracing invisible patterns in the air as the blade hovered, poised over each marked surface. Their eyes, shadowed beneath hoods, glimmered with unwavering focus, each gesture exacting, each motion a thread woven into the tapestry of ritual. The boy near me flinched but did not break, and I could see the tension in the woman opposite me easing, replaced by a rigid, almost imperceptible calm. We were all caught in the same rhythm, each heartbeat syncing with the vibration of the altar, every inhalation drawn into the flow of the ceremony. A faint hum threaded through the chamber, vibrating through stone and marrow alike, and I realized with a shock that it was not merely sound. It was presence. Something ancient, vast, beyond comprehension, threaded itself into the ritual, infusing the space with a weight that demanded absolute attention. I could sense it in the pull of the torchlight, in the subtle shiver of the air, in the resonance of the markings on my flesh. It was the Emperor, or perhaps a fragment of his will, reaching into the mortal world to witness, guide, and claim. And I could not deny the awe that swelled within me, fierce and suffocating. The blade moved again, tracing arcs that were at once deliberate and sacred, leaving impressions that burned faintly, not with pain alone, but with purpose. Every line was a statement, a binding, a covenant between flesh and ritual, mortal and divine. I felt the subtle pulse beneath my palms as the altar seemed to accept the offering, its surface vibrating with recognition. A silent acknowledgement that the sacrifice was unfolding perfectly, that each of us had been aligned. Fear persisted, yes, but it was now laced with reverence, a sharpened awareness that each breath, each beat of the heart, each quiver of muscle was part of something immeasurably larger than ourselves. The priest's chants rose and fell in a measured cadence, a hypnotic rhythm that threaded through every corner of the chamber. I felt it in my chest, in the hollow of my throat, in the tension coiled in my limbs. It was not merely ritual. It was a dialogue between mortal and divine, a conversation conducted in the language of sacrifice, endurance, and devotion. The glow from the Emperor's visage seemed to pulse in harmony with this rhythm, painting flickering patterns across the others' faces, reflecting our collective fear, awe, and surrender. Then, as the final line was traced and the blade lifted, the chamber fell into a hushed resonance, a suspended silence that carried more weight than any shout or cry could. The vibration of the altar lingered, threading through every body, binding us together in a shared understanding of what had been given, what had been claimed, and what had been transformed. I felt my own awareness expand beyond the confines of flesh, connected to the others, to the altar, to something eternal, and in that moment, I knew the true nature of devotion. It demanded not only obedience and fear, but the full surrender of self, the recognition that mortality was secondary to the enduring imprint of faith. As the torchlight flickered and the hum of the altar gradually faded, a sense of completion settled over the chamber. We had passed through the crucible of pain, fear, and reverence, emerging bound not only to the altar, but to the imperishable continuity of the ritual itself. And in that quiet aftermath, I understood with unwavering certainty that to be chosen was not an honor or a blessing. It was an awakening, a transformation, an irrevocable step into the current of devotion that would carry us beyond the fragile limitations of flesh, leaving only the echo of obedience, the resonance of faith, and the enduring mark of the Emperor's gaze. The aftermath of the ritual left the chamber thick with a silence that was both oppressive and alive. The torchlight flickered against the carved visage of the Emperor, painting long, wavering shadows across the walls, and I could feel the residual vibration of the altar humming faintly through the stone beneath my feet. Every breath was weighted, every heartbeat amplified, as though the ritual had imprinted itself on our very marrow. I glanced around at the others, the boy, the woman, the countless others whose identities had already merged into the ceremony, and recognized in their eyes the same mixture of awe, fear, and unspoken understanding. We were no longer merely flesh and blood. We were instruments, conduits of a devotion far greater than our comprehension. As we were led from the chamber, the corridors of the Ministorum felt alien, as though time and space had shifted in response to our transformation. The air was thick with incense and the residual metallic tang of blood clinging to robes and skin alike. Every step echoed against stone walls carved with ancient litanies, their inscriptions catching the torchlight in patterns that seemed to move when not directly observed. I felt the eyes of unseen observers upon us, fragments of devotion scattered throughout the structure, witnesses to our passage from mortal fear to ritualized purpose. Each step forward was both liberation and binding, a paradox that left my chest tight and my senses heightened. Whispers of rumor and prayer drifted through the corridors, voices that spoke of the Emperor's gaze, his judgment, and his will. None dared speak directly. To do so would have been sacrilege, a fracture in the alignment that now bound us together. Yet I felt the weight of those murmurs, the intangible pressure of faith and expectation pressing against my mind, urging awareness and submission in equal measure. The Ministorum itself seemed alive. Every stone, every torch, every faint echo of distant footfalls contributing to a network of devotion that extended far beyond the walls. In that moment, I realized that being chosen was not merely a matter of ritual or flesh. It was an entry into a continuum where mortality was subordinate to purpose, and fear was refined into vigilance, endurance, and obedience. The boy beside me finally lowered his gaze, lips moving in a silent prayer that seemed almost audible in the charged stillness. I could see the tremor in his hands, now steadier, tempered by the intensity of experience, and I recognized my own reflection in his fear and awe. We were mirrors of one another, all bound by the crucible we had passed, all tethered to the altar and the unseen force that had claimed our presence. And yet, despite the uniformity imposed by ritual, there was individuality lingering in each pulse, each breath, each unspoken thought, a subtle defiance of mortality against the overwhelming weight of devotion. We entered a larger hall, where sunlight, alien, distant, almost mythic, pierced the high windows and dusted the stone floors with fragmented gold. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the sacrificial chamber, yet it did little to ease the tension coiled in my chest. Here, the Ministorum's hierarchy observed in silence, their gazes assessing, weighing, judging. Robed figures with vox grills and data slates moved among us, recording, calculating, aligning, as though our very presence had become data to be integrated into the Emperor's design. It was not merely ceremony here. It was observation, measurement, and codification of lives already offered, lives already changed irrevocably. I felt the residual warmth of the altar in my skin, the hum of devotion embedded in my veins, and realized that I had crossed a threshold. Life outside the ritual, beyond the walls of the Ministorum, was no longer wholly mine to inhabit. Each heartbeat, each breath, was threaded with purpose, tied to the continuum of devotion that extended outward, connecting all who had been chosen, all who would be chosen, to a rhythm that transcended individual existence. The Emperor's presence, fragmented, imagined, or real, hovered at the edge of perception, and I could not separate reverence from fear, obedience from survival, and as we were led further into the vast, echoing halls, I understood the nature of life between the altar and the throne. It was existence suspended on the fulcrum of devotion, where mortality served purpose, where fear became awareness, and where every moment was a negotiation between flesh and the immensity of an eternal gaze. I could feel it in my chest, a weight that pressed both down and outward, anchoring me to a reality simultaneously immediate and infinite. The threshold had been crossed. There was no turning back. We were between life and the throne, and the path forward demanded complete surrender. The corridors that led us deeper into the Ministorum were labyrinthine, their walls etched with prayers so old the stone itself seemed to whisper them. Each step we took echoed like a heartbeat inside a great cathedral, reverberating off vaulted ceilings lined with statues of saints who had long since been reduced to myth. The air was cooler here, thinner, tinged with the faint metallic tang of recycled air systems hidden behind the walls, but the incense clung stubbornly to everything. It was a scent that had long since ceased to be pleasant. It was a constant reminder of devotion, of obligation, of permanence. I noticed how our group moved now, not as individuals, but as a single organism. The boy who had trembled before now walked with measured steps, lips pressed tightly shut. The woman opposite me still kept her gaze fixed ahead, but there was something almost defiant in the set of her jaw, as if she had resolved to endure whatever came next with silent pride. We were all different, yet the ritual had sculpted our fear into something uniform. We were bound not by choice but by inevitability, and the rhythm of our footfalls seemed to say so with every step. You are chosen, you are chosen, you are chosen. The walls themselves bore witness. I could feel it in the way the carved imperial aquila seemed to shift in the corner of my eye, in how the flicker of the lumen globes revealed shapes in the shadows that dissolved when I looked directly at them. Rumors whispered by pilgrims told of fragments of the Emperor's will scattered across Terra, inhabiting sacred places as echoes of his gaze. Whether that was true or only the desperate imaginings of the faithful, I could not say. Yet as we walked, I felt that presence pressing at the edge of my awareness, a vast, unseen current, not entirely benevolent, not entirely merciful, but inexorable. Our path opened into a hall so vast it might have been mistaken for a hangar bay. Pillars rose like the trunks of petrified trees, disappearing into a darkness high above. Sunlight, filtered and refracted through layers of ancient stained glass, fell in fractured beams across the floor, illuminating motes of dust that spun lazily in the still air. Here, the hum of hidden machinery replaced the priest's chants. Servitors drifted past like pale ghosts, their limbs replaced with data ports and incense dispensers. Their blank faces turned slightly as we passed, as if even they could sense the shift in our lives. At the far end of the hall stood a raised dais lined with robed figures whose faces were hidden behind ornate vox masks. They held data slates and styluses of polished bone, their fingers moving with mechanical precision. We were herded to stand before them in silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as one of the figures stepped forward, its robes embroidered with symbols of the adeptus terra. Its voice emerged through the vox grill in a low, modulated tone, neither cruel nor kind, but absolute. It spoke words of record-keeping and designation, of names stripped away and replaced by numbers, of destinies sealed before the throne itself. Something inside me tightened as I listened. My name, which had once anchored me to my life beyond these walls, dissolved in the sound of that voice. It was not shouted, not taken violently. It was simply replaced, erased as efficiently as a flick of a stylus across parchment. I felt the weight of the markings on my skin, the invisible tether of the ritual still binding me, and knew that whatever I had been before had no place here. This was the space between life and the throne, and individuality was a thing to be surrendered like breath in cold air. Yet even in that moment of erasure, some small, stubborn spark of self remained. It flickered weakly beneath the weight of devotion, a whisper of memory, a name spoken silently in my mind. I dared not speak it aloud. In this place, such defiance was not rebellion. It was survival, a quiet acknowledgement that though my body and purpose had been claimed, a fragment of thought, a fragment of self, still lingered in the shadowed corners of my being. And I held on to it, not in hope of escape, but because I sensed that even the Emperor's will was carved from countless such fragments, a vast mosaic of souls subsumed into purpose. The vox-masked figure finished its recitation, and silence reclaimed the hall. The servitors drifted closer, their mechanical limbs extending as they prepared to escort us deeper still, toward a chamber whose doors were sealed with massive locking runes. The scent of oil and sanctified machine fluid drifted from beyond, mingling with the fading incense. We were being drawn toward something larger, something final, something that waited in the shadow between sacrifice and eternity.